So there's something that I want to talk about, and it's disorganized speech. Let's see if I can talk about disorganized speech. It's difficult to do so because I will descend into disorganized speech while addressing it. And, you know, this may be a good place to start, precisely, that it seems that I find it very difficult to keep a straight line from wherever it is that I begin expressing an idea to some sort of an end destination or conclusion. On the way to that conclusion, many different sort of branches are opened up, and I take different routes and it takes me to different places. It's kind of like opening Wikipedia and just reading half an article and then opening a new tab and reading half of that tab and never reading a full article, just sort of navigating the links in the articles. And I find this interesting because it seems, first of all, that this is something that I find very difficult to avoid. So it's not just a style, it's not just like my style of speech is to speak this way. It feels more like a black hole that I can't avoid being sucked into. As if wherever it is that my interest is, there's this sort of black hole. It sucks me in that direction. And then I can't follow a strict, rigid plan or something like that goes against that instinct or that interest, desire. And well, you know, the reason I'm bringing this up is because it seems to me that there is a way in which your speech can become more disorganized or less disorganized according to, you know, our conventions of organized speech. And so there can be times when your speech is very disorganized, times when it's not as disorganized. And as I said, it's not like, I don't think it's a personal style exactly, because it feels more like a black hole. It feels more like when you start talking, if you have difficulty organizing your speech, you're following, again, it's almost like you're following pleasure in a very kind of primal sort of way. And so whatever words bring you pleasure, those are the words you go towards. Even if those words don't really make sense. It's kind of the principle of automatic speech or something. Or like the idea in shamanism of glossolalia, speaking in tongues and so forth, you know, just saying the first sounds that come to your mind. And when you do that, if you actually try doing glossolalia, speaking in tongues, and let yourself go with it, you find that it's trance-inducing. I suppose this is why it's associated to shamanism, because it is trance-inducing. I mean, you can see clearly in all the videos of people speaking in tongues and so on, that if you were to really abandon yourself to it and just do it, it would enter you into a trance. And I suppose this is my theory as to why that happens, is because you're following pleasure in some way. You're getting yourself drunk on pleasure. It's as if to organized speech, you sometimes maybe need to say things that you're not super interested in at the moment, but you know that they will lead to a greater kind of interest in the end. There is a big theme you want to talk about, and you're interested in talking about this big theme, and your focus is on the big theme. So the words you're saying now in the present aren't, so it's not that important for you to enjoy them. However, in the situation I'm speaking in now, it's almost as if those poles are reversed. And when I'm talking, I don't have any big theme that I'm trying to talk about. In fact, by the time I finish recording one of these videos, I have always spoken about things that I didn't expect I would speak about. You know, like the whatever theme emerges seems to emerge spontaneously and seems to construct itself without me trying to put order into it. The only place where I'm putting order is the absolute focus on saying whatever feels good to say in the present. With a slight amount, of course, and that's the point of the video, with a slight amount of censorship, right? Because without that slight amount of social censorship, I would just descend into glossolalia. Or probably an id aspect would take over, and I would just begin saying extremely offensive things. So that's interesting, because it feels as if by allowing yourself to say whatever it is that's interesting in the present moment, you lose conscious touch with the overall scheme of what you're saying, and in that strange way you're not really focused on the future. And because of that, it's as if the act of speaking in this way drags you down into the present moment in a way that is trance-inducing. You know, it's as if getting deep into the present moment is something that triggers some kind of psychedelic reaction in the brain or something. It's something I always feel with psychedelics, that psychedelics seem to be radiantly present. They sort of put me in the present moment very intensely, or have put me in the past. I think that's maybe also interesting to mention, that I haven't taken anything resembling a psychedelic in many years, and so I'm speaking with a certain distance, and I like that. It helps, I think, to speak about it as something that's in the past and that I can look at it sort of in hindsight. I don't know why. I think that maybe is interesting. Is maybe an interesting aspect of this, because probably because of the way that I think psychedelics can change the way you see the world in the present moment, in whatever moment you are. I mean, I remember after I took mushrooms for the first time, my daily sober life was different for a prolonged period of time. You know, I had a different way of seeing things, different way of interacting with people. You know, the usual thing that people say after they take a strong psychedelic, that it's sort of as if it readjusts certain beliefs and structures that affect your sober life, right? Its effects aren't entirely chemical. It's not all about brain chemistry, because if the trip has made you see things in a different way, then it's psychotherapy, right? After you come out of it, something has changed at the personality level, and that makes your day-to-day life different. So I find it interesting then, because from that perspective you can talk about the psychedelic experience from a certain angle. It gives you an insight into it because you're living it in the present. But now I feel as if that is far away enough that I can speak about it from a different angle. And I guess one of the angles that gives me, I think, is this is precisely this aspect of the presentness of it. I think that the presentness of it is not as visible when you're right in it, because it's like being a fish in water. You know, you can't describe the water so well, maybe, or you describe it in a certain way, and I feel that what I find interesting about treating psychedelic experiences as something not to have regularly, but as something to leave as an experience in the past so that you can look at them, is that precisely you can maybe think about what was it that created that sense of being in the present. Because that's sort of what I want to get at here. That sense of being in the present, which is so incredible in psychedelics, it feels to me as if many things point to an idea, which is the idea that it's something that you could do without psychedelics, right? And this is a main issue for Terence McKenna, for example, right? That his angle on this is that even if you could, that there are many reasons to prefer the use of the plant. But I feel like, how do I say this? Well, I suppose there are many reasons for me to want to find alternatives. I suppose one is very practical, and it's simply that I find it very difficult to take psychedelics these days because it's too much. I always feel that it could just bring on a panic attack or something, and who knows, maybe it's good to really just allow yourself to have a bad trip, but I have my doubts. I think that there are times when taking a psychedelic, depending what state of mind you're in, isn't a good idea, especially if you're in a state of mind that resembles psychosis or something like that, or that seems to approach it in some way, and I would definitely identify with that. It seems that psychedelics in those cases just maybe are traumatic, not in a way that is healing, not in that kind of just allowing yourself to experience a traumatic event and then like cathartically going through it. I feel that there is a way in which psychedelics under a slightly psychotic state of mind can just be traumatic in a way that makes it ever more difficult to reach that presentness, that spontaneous presentness that is so liberating about the psychedelic experience. So I think that there are maybe good reasons to try and think of ways in which one could find that spontaneity without the use of psychedelics. And the other reason maybe to do that is because this psychotic state of mind that I'm talking about I feel is... I'm not sure what I want to say about this exactly. One thing that comes to mind is this potential for psychosis, I think, is present precisely in a lot of the people who are interested in these kinds of quests, That seems to have been, from what I can tell, one of the things that happened in the 60s, right? That people became burnt out on drugs because I think that you have to be a certain kind of person, I think, to use psychedelics regularly, I feel. I think that there is a kind of person, like me, where after a while it again it can put you close to that kind of psychotic state. And it's funny because, again, this is one of the reasons that people criticize psychedelics for, right? That because so many people who have taken psychedelics have developed things like psychosis and schizophrenia, that therefore the psychedelics are bad because they trigger this in people. But I think that that's not, I mean, how do I say this? It's true, but what's bad about it isn't that. Like, what's going on, I think, is that what we call a psychotic state of mind is something that has deep roots, I feel, in the psyche. It's not, I think, an illness. There are, how do I say this? There are symptoms, right? There are, let's say, forms of suffering and discomfort that we associate to psychosis, and that we call psychosis, for example. But when you look at these, the actual content of the experience seems to be things like, you know, what doctors would call false beliefs, for example, right? Believing false things, seeing signs and symbols, thinking that everything is symbolic, thinking that everything is connected, and so on. There is a thin line, or there is a strange line to draw here between that as a fearful experience, as a bad experience, and that as a shamanic experience. It's a line that Terence McKenna, I think, already tried to begin to discuss, but it's, you know, it's easy in a lot of, I feel that a lot of the philosophers of, sort of hippie philosophers of the 70s, like McKenna, possibly Tim Leary, although I'm not familiar with him, and other people like that, Alan Watts, they have, you know, opinions on madness that I think are good. They're an interesting step in the right direction, in the sense that they're countercultural opinions, but they're very broad. They do a very broad brushstroke, and say things like that schizophrenia is just you know, it's just shamanism, but that our culture has so much fear towards it that it turns it into a negative experience, and so on. And you know, I think for a long time I have agreed with this, and I've sort of generally agree with it, because otherwise I find it hard to explain, I suppose, how there could be something so similar to psychosis, such as, you know, paranormal phenomena, synchronicity, seeing things symbolically, and so on. How could that exist in a healthy way, which it seems to, right? And so, right, that's the question that I think that McKenna and Watts and other people were dealing with, probably, is that it seems as if the base symptoms or experience that we associate to psychosis are things that all of those hippie philosophers were probably experiencing in their own life, such as I am experiencing it and other people are experiencing it, right? So, as someone who is experiencing all those symptoms and yet is not having trouble navigating life and navigating social situations and so on, I can see how, the opinion would form that we have these two experiences. One is an experience full of suffering and is what we call an illness, and then the other one is an experience that seems to be divine and that seems to be very natural and that just seems to be the opposite, despite sharing exactly the same content. And so the conclusion in a lot of cases seems to be, in a lot of these texts, that we must save one of the two, right? That either one is true or the other is true. And so, of course, from the perspective of those kinds of speakers, you would say, well, the good one is true, the healthy one is true, and therefore the unhealthy one, the scary one, is scary just because of the shame that's put on it, on the fact that people tell you that it's wrong, or people, basically because of peer pressure, because of all sorts of forms of fear inflicted by culture. And that therefore, if we could get rid of those forms of fear, that the experience would just dissolve into something good, right? Again, treating it in a sort of set and setting kind of way, as if it were a psychedelic experience, that people who are suffering from psychosis are having exactly the same kind of experience as someone who's having an incredibly divine experience, but the set and setting is wrong. Maybe they're in prison, or they're in a mental hospital, or their family is accusing them and putting shame on them for how they are, and so on. And the set and setting is what's twisting the experience into something toxic. And again, for a long time I've agreed with this, but I question these days whether that's what's going on, because I think that there is the possibility, you see, what that whole spiel was about was that you have two choices, and so you feel as if you need to make one of those two choices. So these two experiences appear to be the same, psychosis, shamanic experience, so it's either one or the other. But I think that actually both of them can exist, both of them can coexist. Right? That in fact, they are the same. You could say, in some sense, that they are the same, right? They both involve seeing the world symbolically. They both involve all sorts of things like that. But, in the same way that, water is something that can be nutritious, or it can be a poison. You can drink too much water and die from water poisoning, right? So, sort of the same idea, that a lot of that kind of 60s philosophy seems to assume that this kind of water, this kind of spirit water, is 100% good, and that no matter how much you drink of it, it's always good. And that, therefore, any negative experiences are just due to the filter you're seeing it through, and the filter that has been imposed on you by culture and by other people. But I wonder, couldn't there just be the possibility that this water, spirit, libido, whatever it may be, you can have too much of it, and so the experience of psychosis would be something that isn't just caused by culture. It's not just caused by fear and by the filter through which you're seeing the experience, but maybe there is a component of it that has to do with the experience itself, and let's say that the dosage of the experience, that maybe you just have too much of it for whatever reason. Maybe the reasons why too much of it is being had are cultural, maybe it's sort of flowing into your psyche too much because of certain ways in which you've become too open to things like peer pressure or whatever it may be that maybe is part of this. But also another possibility alongside this one is that the focus in those kinds of 60s philosophy tends to be on culture, right? That it is culture, human culture, that that is responsible for twisting the shamanic experience into a psychosis. In the things that are taught to us as children, right? That we're born in a way that makes us already fear the experience of identifying with the divine, right? It's an incredible taboo to identify with the divine, so that whenever an experience arises that puts you into a situation where you identify with the divine, you freak out, and that somehow that's why psychosis happens. It's a freak out, it's fear put on by culture. But again, the thing is that I wonder if culture, human culture, is the only thing, is the only structure at play here, right? That maybe there are bigger structures of bigger sort of balances of force that extend beyond the human level, in psychotherapy terms, we would call, we would already talk of these things, even from a secular point of view, right? Just these huge transpersonal notions of whatever, of good and evil, or the different sort of balancing forces that can't be identified, and that's what the 60s philosophers called culture, right? Because they're transpersonal forces, but precisely that's what we call culture, right? It's these huge forces that have the weight of history behind them, right? So you as an individual have the weight of eons of tradition that tell you that to identify with the divine is a taboo. And it's the weight of that historical transpersonal force that is impinging on you. Okay, but again, what about the potential? I mean, because that's the thing. If we're going to speak about this topic from the perspective, as those philosophers did, from the perspective of someone who believes that the experience seen through the lens of shamanism or mysticism is true, then how would I say this? Then potential ways of mapping out forces that go beyond the human are also, reasonable to take into consideration, such as the Tree of Life, the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, or all the sort of Buddhist maps of all the different levels of hell, and all the different kind of ways in which extremely archetypal forces are playing on things, astrology of course, and so on. All of these maps describe things that in principle could have been, sort of balances of force, balances of tendency and of mood that could have easily predated humans, right? Things that have to do with just balances and structures, sort of psychic structures that are older than humans, under the mystical sort of picture that that the psyche is not something that emerges on planet Earth with the human, but that the psyche is sort of the very structure of reality, of the divine imagination, and so forth. So that in that kind of picture, it's not just it's not just the weight of these huge historical forces impinging on the individual. It could be the weight of eons-long forces. You know what I mean? And when I say eons, I'm just it's sort of a euphemism to talk about eternity, about just sort of an incredibly rich mandala of structures and forces and hierarchies of power, to put it this way, that extend well beyond what we usually consider to be culture. If that were the case, and again I think that's an idea that isn't as difficult to take seriously once the experience has been taken seriously, be it the psychedelic experience or whatever other experience of this nature. If that idea is taken seriously, then it becomes a bit more difficult maybe to defend the idea that the shamanic experience becomes sour only due to culture, you know, and that if culture was sort of different, that then it would be 100% a good experience, as if the forces of culture were the only forces at play in determining whether something is a psychosis or is a shamanic experience, right? Because if there are forces at play and again sort of weird sort of hierarchies of tendency and stuff like that that go beyond the time and space that we consider human culture, then no matter how pure and perfect human culture is, any individual, any subject, any being could fall into what we call a psychosis, due to forces that are beyond that something, right? That maybe it's not just a question of culture. It is, of course, that opens a whole other series of questions that are probably impossible to answer because they extend so beyond, precisely because they extend so beyond the realm of culture. But that, what would the word psychosis even mean in this context of something that extends beyond culture, right? How would we judge it as such, and so on? But maybe again, tentatively, I would like to suggest that just the possibility, again, just as a sort of like a mental exercise almost, that what if the notion of health and sickness is very basic, very sort of fundamental, and that therefore sickness could occur at it could occur in many ways, and that maybe it's not just culture that is responsible for it. It's interesting to me because those two things I sort of try to bring in, the idea that there are forces beyond culture, and also the idea that maybe you can drink too much water and get water poisoning, understanding water as spirit in this case. Both of those ideas seem to be ideas that are relevant to what I assume to be occultism, an occult practice, right? Because in occultism there is, let's say, it's interesting, there is less of an optimism as in other kinds of traditions, but ultimately there is a great optimism, I think. I think that things like occultism allow a great optimism to emerge precisely thanks to contemplating all sorts of things that could be dangerous or that could go wrong, right? Because in occultism there is the possibility that you could mess with energies that you shouldn't mess with, right? Whereas in a slightly more new agey idea, all energies are good, and it's just culture's responsibility and your responsibility to stop judging them as negative and so on, right? So that any negative force is just seen as negative because of the filter through which you're seeing it, but that it actually, everything is good and everything is pure. Again, I think that this kind of optimism is eventually reached through something like occultism, but in a different way, through a different route. That I find more useful for the present moment, because at the moment we do exist in a world where you can experience such things as psychosis, right? So I think that it's worth to maybe treat them as a serious threat and a serious problem. I think that sometimes there is, again, it's just another side to the coin, another side to the conversation, because what Terence McKenna and Alan Watts and so on were saying is a good thing to say, I think. Again, as I said, because it's a countercultural thing to say, and it's a good thing to say that that psychosis is due to culture. Because then it opens up the conversation regarding how to fix it, right? That's the conversation that it opens up. It opens up the conversation about how to fix it. How do we fix this problem? Well, we fix it by changing our attitude, changing culture's attitudes and so on. So it starts a whole process of activism in some form or another, right? Terence McKenna, for example, suggests that making art would be a great way to do this, because you're sort of spreading memes through culture, as he would say, right? And all sorts of other ways in which art could potentially be a transformative thing, and so on. So it's about fixing, it's about healing. And that's great. That's a good aspect of it. But I think that what occultism and other things like that provide, which I think maybe is equally as important, is not how to heal it, but how to avoid it. You know what I mean? Protection. Protection, to the New Age perspective, seems like I think it can seem like a bad idea, because it implies fear. It implies fear. If you feel that you need to protect yourself from something, that already puts you in a fearful mood, and it's precisely this fearful mood, the New Age would tell you, that is putting you into the terrifying situation that you find yourself in. So that, in order to get out of it, you need to somehow overcome that fear. But, that's the thing. Even if that is true, again, it boils down to just the practical reality of the fact that people do have psychosis. People do have terrifying psychotic breakdowns, terrifying experiences with all this kind of stuff, these kinds of journeys into a symbolic language. So, if people have these experiences, it means, I think, that we're very we're very liable to have them. As I say, that there is a thin sort of thing to tread here between, yes, I agree that feeling fear is already what attracts the experience. But I think that there is also something to be said about realism, being realistic, that maybe, because again, if we are dealing, and again this is another thing of the occultism stuff, if we are dealing with forces as described in astrology and Buddhism and so on, forces that extend beyond human history, then it could be that no matter how much you want to overcome your fears, maybe you're fighting a fight against an enormous leviathan of cosmic forces, and that it would be a sort of egoic inflation to a certain degree to think that you on your own, as some sort of a Christ figure, could combat the fear generated by all of that, right? Because it's one thing to say that you're going to combat cultural issues, but when you're talking about things that maybe extend beyond that, maybe it's good to treat them with the kind of fear that you would have of a river, for example. You don't need to, because when I say fear, you don't necessarily need to imagine this stuff as being, scary beasts hiding in the otherworld. You can just imagine it literally as terrain. It's terrain that extends beyond what we usually consider to be terrain in time and space. And what does terrain have? Well, terrain has mountains, valleys, rivers, oceans, all sorts of things. And you need to navigate different terrains in different ways. If you want to cross a river, a very furious river, if you're not careful, if you don't protect yourself, by which I mean maybe, wear a swimsuit or something, or sort of be aware that you're going to have to swim or whatever. Or no, let's give another example. If you find yourself in front of a furious river, water just flowing down, and there's a waterfall on the other side, and you know that if you jump into this river, you're just going to be swept away and fall down a waterfall, then you can say, I think I won't cross this river. That's protection. That's what I mean by protection. I mean fear in the good sense. It's good to be afraid of that river. Why would you not be afraid of that river? You can see that you're not going to be able to cross it, Not everything is an obstacle that can be destroyed by the Christ mind. I think that it's good to have a certain degree of fear of terrain, of different kinds of terrain. Maybe, if you're going down into a valley at night and it's cold and you have nowhere to sleep, you're like, well, I'll wear a jacket or whatever. Just those kinds of notions in the realm of the psychic space are good to have. And I think that occultism is one of the traditions that I've seen that takes that seriously. I think that shamanism takes this seriously too, from what I can tell. Shamanism takes this seriously too. But it doesn't seem to have percolated into the New Age as it developed from the 60s onwards, from what I can tell. Yes, maybe I'm being unfair. My idea of the New Age is a slightly straw man idea. I haven't engaged with it that deeply, but and there are ideas of protection in the New Age, definitely. A lot of them, in fact. There's a whole idea of crystals and saging a room and stuff like that. But again, I think that those ideas, how do I say it? I think they make sense in a context, in an occult kind of context that accepts fear, having a certain kind of fear of, fear of the Lord kind of thing, fear of a raging river. It's not fear because it's evil. The river isn't evil. It's fear just because you're accepting a certain reality, a certain limit, a Saturnian limit about the situation. I have a limit. I can't cross this river. Not yet. Maybe I need to build a boat or something, but I don't have a boat yet. So at this point in time, I need to accept that I can't cross it. Or at least make a choice, a bet. I'm betting that I can't cross it. And I feel that in a lot of what I've encountered of the New Age, yes, sure, there's crystals and stuff like that, but very often, and I don't want to, nothing against crystals and stuff like that. Precisely that the problem is that I see a tendency to use protection, but as an entirely, how do I say it, entirely love-driven thing, without taking fear into consideration, maybe, right? It's all driven by the good, but not by the evil, and not by an awareness of the evil. If we consider like the river to be evil in that sense, not the river is evil, but your choice to cross it would maybe be a bad choice if your interest is to survive, for example, right? Right? A lot of the protection and stuff like that I see in the New Age, again, it's just the impression I get, it seems to be driven by the idea that everything is ultimately good, and that therefore all you need to protect yourself against are like cultural things, like maybe you will use protection to ward off toxic energies from your environment, or sort of human kind of things, But what about the huge kind of stuff that extends beyond, the forces that extend beyond? So, psychosis. That's why I think that maybe owing a huge debt to people like Terence McKenna and Alan Watts, who begin this discussion. I think that maybe precisely in the spirit of that kind of thinking, it would maybe be good to take the conversation in new directions. I say new directions because, of course, occultism has been talking about this for years. Sorry, not years, for whatever, for a long time. Shamanism, there's probably ideas about this in shamanism. It's not so much bringing the conversation to a new place, but maybe about precisely allowing some of these old ideas to be taken seriously today. Because I think that this is just a hunch, but I feel that maybe the reason why the mainstream New Age doesn't take so seriously the idea of fear and of huge forces like that is because it's just not socially acceptable. It delves into a realm of belief that is psychotic, right? Precisely because it introduces the element of fear. But I think that maybe, precisely if we are to deal with this problem of psychosis, maybe one step is to integrate everything about the psychotic perspective that maybe is right, is correct, and maybe the fear is correct. And that because of that, maybe an element of protection is necessary, not just healing, but protection. So not just love, but also fear. Both of them. Again, in all of the sort of old systems, this is in place. In the Tree of Life, this is in place, right? One side of the Tree of Life is acceptance, the other one is limit. There's Saturn, there's Jupiter, and there's the sort of the correspondence between them. And so, psychosis, therefore, this opens up a whole sort of thing, because, as I was saying before, it seems to me that then what we call a shamanic way of seeing the world, it's not that it's different from psychosis, but I think that it does mean that the act of losing the act of losing the ability to surf the experience can be due to all sorts of things that maybe are not entirely cultural. And that maybe therefore require not just healing but protection. And returning it to some of the earlier things that I was saying, it seems to have something to do with the present moment. And that is why I feel that different alternatives to psychedelics should be explored. Because the psychedelic experience, again, if we're talking about water as a metaphor for spirit, it seems as if sometimes the psychedelic experience can just be an inrush of water that is too much for certain people. And it can bring water poisoning. But it does seem that this basic aspect of it, this correspondence between the psychedelic experience and the present moment, is of importance. Because it goes both ways. Again, as I was saying, it's not in regard to glossolalia and speaking in tongues, for example, right? That it's not just that the psychedelic experience seems to put you into the present moment, as meditation would. It's that being in the present moment through speaking in tongues, through some sort of a shamanic trance-inducing method, being in the present moment in that trance-like way generates a psychedelic experience, right? It goes both ways. It's not just that the plants put you into the present moment. It's that the present moment bring you to the plants. It brings you to the same kind of place that the plants would, right? Again, shamanism, non-psychedelic shamanism is all about this. Shamanic journeying is all about this, right? Entering into a trance-like state in which you are having vivid, closed-eyed visuals. You do enter into that realm. Terence McKenna says, that it doesn't reach the peaks of intensity of the mushroom. But maybe that's a good thing for some people. For people who need less dosage in order to navigate it, but who still require or would benefit from something that draws them into the present moment and that allows, therefore, them to express themselves spontaneously. And so, in a weird kind of way, this leads me back to what I was saying at the start about disorganized speech. Because it seems to me that, as I was saying, disorganized speech seems to be a slow-mo version of glossolalia. Disorganized speech in itself seems to be like a shamanic form of focusing on the present moment. Why are certain people in that mode of speech? Why am I and anyone else who finds difficulty organizing the speech in that state of in that state that seems to emulate shamanic practice? It seems to emulate it spontaneously, this practice of something that just draws you into the present moment. Because, as I'm saying, like, this form of speech, it has a psychedelic effect. That's the thing, that it goes both ways. Just engaging in this kind of spontaneous expression in the present moment gives you it gives you a different bodily sensation. I feel different from when I started speaking. It does something that approaches what meditation does or what psychedelics do, very lightly, but it approaches it. It approaches it enough to speculate on all this stuff. How is it that not just a consciously chosen shamanic practice of ritual inducing, of trance-inducing something or other, not just a consciously chosen trance-induction takes you there, but that somehow there are states of mind where, for whatever reason, the psyche just gets drawn to a black hole of presentness in its self-expression. And the mystery of psychosis, I think, is very tied into this, because, again, it seems to me, from what I can tell, that psychosis, schizophrenia, one of the things that characterizes it is also disorganized speech. But disorganized speech at a level that is much, much deeper than the kind of disorganized speech that I have now, right? Because now I'm not following, like, I've just opened up a million different topics and I've gone here and there, and this is not a bullet point linear presentation. So it's disorganized in a certain way, and it's also, I can feel that it's difficult for me to follow a bullet point thing. I like it. I enjoy making scripted videos because it exercises this part of my brain that I don't exercise often, and I feel that there is a great benefit in that. But yeah, I can recognize that there is something disorganized in this way of speaking. I can recognize that this is a video, but in a conversation with other people, this becomes slightly more apparent, because I find it very difficult sometimes to stick to a topic, and this can sometimes bother people, or I get the impression that it can bother people, and I completely understand, right? Because it becomes difficult to even finish sentences, right? It's as if halfway through a sentence I branch off into a different sentence, blah blah blah. That is frustrating to listen to. But so anyway, that to me tells me that there is something about my speech that is disorganized in this way, but that there are deeper levels of disorganization. Again, according to the standards of organized speech of our culture, which I think are relatively good standards of organized speech, that according to that kind of standard, people going through a deep psychosis or schizophrenia, their speech becomes even more disorganized. So, what's going on there? It's as if they approach even closer this black hole of glossolalia. It's almost as if their psyche requires very deeply this kind of a shamanic focus. That's one possibility. That and of course it may also explain the whole issue, now that I think of it, of seeing things, of visions, right? people with schizophrenia can see things, hear things, and so on. So, of course, if shamanic drumming, let's say, if like shamanic trance-induction, like disorganized speech, which is like glossolalia, if that kind of shamanic trance-induction can bring about a psychedelic state of affairs, if it's already kind of like affecting my kind of body high, even just at this kind of level, and you know, and in shamanic contexts it can explode into shamanic journeying, then clearly if someone finds themselves in a state where their speech is even closer to glossolalia, where they literally have much less of a social filter than I have, and therefore they just say the first thing that comes into their head, or the first thing that, well, I'm jumping to a conclusion there. I don't know if it's the first thing that comes into their head, but let's say that, you know, that there is a way in which they're not sticking to what we would consider linearity. If that has a psychedelic effect, then maybe that's what happens with visions and so on. That in the same way that entering into a psychedelic state of mind, a shamanic journeying state of mind, would make you see things, in a psychotic state, you also shamanically drum yourself into a state of seeing things, into a psychedelic state. But one that you don't wish, one that you don't, it's like someone spiked your drink or something. It's like, that's maybe one way of looking at it, that it's not like just a beautiful experience that if you could get rid of the fear it would be wonderful, but that maybe there's an element to that, but that maybe there's also just the element that it was something not wished for, or something that you yeah, well, a problem to be taken seriously, I suppose. But then what that says about disorganized speech, I think, is, well, this is what this is what I want to say about it, that disorganized speech as a symptom, or as a description of a person with psychosis, tends to be seen by our culture. Here I will focus on culture for a second. It tends to be seen as a problem. That is to say, and in many cases it maybe is even seen as a problem by the person who's suffering it as well. Maybe, you know, they would want to be able to express themselves in a way that is understood. I don't know, it's harder to judge, but I personally, I have found myself in situations where I wish that my ability to keep a linear path and to finish my sentences was more developed, right? So if just by speculative association, if I can also wish sometimes that I had a better grasp on my linear thinking, on my left brain, maybe people who are deeper into a state of disorganized speech also feel that. So maybe, you know, it can be felt as a problem by the person who is experiencing it, and by culture, by the doctors and so on. But I see a problem with that, because it feels to me as if the way we treat disorganized speech, I think, as a culture, is that it's not just a problem, but it's an absurd problem, a chaotic problem, that the patient's disorganized speech is just a chaotic thing that's happening. Their brain is just messed up, and it's like they are a robot or something, and all the parts of speech are kind of messed up, and their speech is just firing chaotically. And I think that, again, I don't know what the state-of-the-art medical attention for this kind of stuff is these days, but at least, let's say, in popular parlance, which goes a long way to generating these fear-driven expectations of culture. In the popular mind, I think that this is seen as, again, as a sort of broken brain problem. And that therefore, what one needs to do is to fix the brain, or to attempt to fix the brain chemistry or whatever is going on, so that that person can come back to organized speech land. Right? I think that's how we treat it. As if it's like an absurd, chaotic thing that is happening. There is no value and no meaning to what is happening. It's just absolutely chaotic, and you just need to drag them back somehow to our safe land of coherence. But I see a clear problem with this the second you start to draw parallels, as I am trying to do in this video. When you start to draw parallels between the experience of someone like myself, like others, who identify with the symptoms of psychosis, but aren't, let's say, suffering from them in a way that would warrant me to get that kind of medical care. If you know what I mean. That if we're going to draw parallels between these two experiences, that this is disorganized speech. There are more organized forms of speech behind me, let's say, and there are more disorganized forms of speech in front of me, and I'm placing myself now in a center, just for the purposes of this, because I think I'm invoking Hegel a lot recently, despite not having read him, but in this sort of like Hegelian way that I'm seeing myself. I think that it's difficult for me or for the subject maybe to not see themselves as the center of a dialectic. You see people who are very different from you on the one side and people who are very, very different from you on the other, and you see that you somehow are the center point between them. And I think that maybe that's just something that we all do in order to understand our surroundings. See ourselves as the, what do we completely not identify with on different sides of the spectrum. But what that allows then is that I think that if you find yourself able to do that, to both, I can both identify with the world of mainstream culture, so to speak, and I think, at least I this is just my tentative kind of suggestion, is that I think that there is, as Terence McKenna, as Alan Watts, as all those 60s philosophers suggested, there does seem to be a way in which you can identify with the symptoms of psychosis, despite having them at a much more alleviated level. And what that does then is that I can speculate that my disorganized speech, my relationship to it, to me, I feel that there is a lot of meaning in it, and that it is not a chaotic thing at all. So it allows me to speculate that it may also be a meaningful thing in the case of severe schizophrenia. And that therefore, maybe this is one area in which we need to think of different ways to approach this problem. What do I find meaningful about it? I think it's because, well, a good place to start maybe is to think why is my speech disorganized? Maybe this is a very fundamental question that I haven't even asked yet. Why is my speech disorganized? I think the way I experience it is that things come into my mind as I'm speaking, like I was saying before, and I am very tempted to express them. So maybe I haven't even finished a sentence yet. Maybe I'm halfway through a sentence and I'm already thinking of something else, and it's irresistible to me to say it, to not say it. Why is it irresistible? It's not just because it's always so nice, so interesting. There is a negative component to it too, which is almost like that it becomes very difficult to not pay attention to these other thoughts and emotions that are crowding your awareness as you are speaking. It becomes difficult to not give them attention because they become louder than the linear speech that is coming out of your mouth. I think that there are several examples that maybe many people would be able to identify with about this. Like in an argument between two people, maybe an argument between two lovers, for example. We've all seen these kinds of scenes where an incredibly small, mundane event becomes like the starting point for a deep matrimonial discussion, argument, not a discussion, and what tends to happen in those things is that what is being said is just half of the picture. Actually, there is a lot more going on underneath the surface. So maybe someone's saying, you forgot to wash the dishes again. But actually, what is being expressed through that conversation is something that reaches way beyond dishes, and it has to do with a whole set of built-up experiences stretching as far back as this couple can remember. Right? So through these small microcosmic things, big macrocosmic things are being implied. And so someone who's engaged in that kind of conversation, they're saying one thing and the other person is saying one thing, but actually there is a huge context, a huge subtext to what is happening that probably is much more present in their minds. Like, probably their mouths are talking about the dishes, but their hearts are feeling a whole other things that have nothing to do with the dishes. So you could almost say that their awareness, their attention, is much, much, much more flooded with external things than with the conversation that's directly at hand. Right? And I feel that disorganized speech to me feels a bit like this, but maybe in a less dramatic way, perhaps, I don't know, where it's as if it has something to do with symbolic language again, and that's why it all ties it back to psychosis, because if everything that you're saying and that you're perceiving is charged with a symbolic value, then everything that you're saying seems to you to have a whole other set of associations to it. And it's as if your awareness is paying attention much more to those associations than to the word itself that you've said. And so it can get to this point where you're speaking and words are coming out of your mouth, but your attention is not on the words that you're saying, but on the emotions that it's eliciting. Perhaps that's why perhaps that's why it's so right brain oriented, because it's something about how your focus is much more on how it feels. Like I was saying before, it's about saying words that feel good. It's glossolalia in that sense. It almost has nothing to do with what the words mean, because the meaning of it, due to its symbolic resonances, is so far-reaching that your mind can't hold it in an intellectual way. Your mind is racing, seeing all these associations between things, and therefore it's racing so much that all you can do is just kind of be in the present moment in a trance-like state. That sort of thing. But maybe that's just an approximation as to why I think it happens. I think it happens because somehow you get into a state of mind where you are perceiving connections between things, which is the whole, again, symbolic, psychotic thing. You're perceiving connections between things. You're perceiving patterns between things. And these patterns dissolve the individuality of certain things. Suddenly, it puts you into more of a right brain state because everything seems to be connected with everything else. And so if you get into that state of mind, your focus, your energy is so invested on perceiving those things that you don't have any energy left to expressing them. All you can do is just kind of like get yourself on autopilot mode and just speak automatically almost, And so of course, because there's no pilot, there's no linear organization. It's disorganized. It's just piloting wherever it wants to go, like automatic drawing, like automatic speech. And it's piloting on auto mode because you can't pilot. You're too focused on the patterns. And it's not a conscious focus, not like I can choose to focus on them or not, right? It's the fact that your awareness is flooded with them. Why your awareness gets flooded with them is a whole other thing that I don't really think I know how to approach at this moment. I think it has something to do with suffering and trauma for some reason. That's kind of where I would usually take it, because that corresponds to the ideas of psychoanalysis as well, right? That somehow it's trauma that makes you see patterns between things. I'm not sure how to develop that at the moment. But that's not important, because what I wanted to develop most of all is just that this idea that I think that what's happening, therefore, is that disorganized speech is literally the opposite of linear speech. It's not that the brain is broken, it's that the brain is doing the opposite of linear speech. It's not only that, here's the thing. Especially in the case of psychosis, I think, and let's say in states that approach it, you really get to this aspect of the symbolic value of words and of the associations of words, and you can really see this, I think, in in conversations with people with psychosis, and personally I have felt it at moments in my life when I have felt more deeply in a state of discomfort regarding this. So, you know, when I felt closer to what would be called psychosis, I really felt this sort of the weight of the symbolic on language. And what do I mean by this? Is that you can be talking to someone and say the word house, you know, that's a nice house. And maybe in my mind, like yeah, let's just do it right now as an experiment. What came to my mind when I said the word house was the word mouse, because it rhymes with house. And I visualized a mouse. So when I said house, I immediately, without thinking about it, visualized a mouse and thought of the word mouse, because it rhymes with it, right? So what does that mean? It means that my attention is focusing on a whole set of things that have nothing to do with the word house as I'm using it. It's like my mouth is saying house, but I'm actually thinking about stuff that are symbolically or phonetically or connected to it in some way, but that my, you know, whoever receives my message is not seeing what I am thinking about. You know what I mean? They're just receiving the word house. But I am associating it to all these things. Now, imagine that you're not just doing this with the word house, but you're doing it with every single word you say. Every single word you say seems to elicit puns and correspondences in your mind. It makes you think of things that rhyme with that word, things that sound like that word, things that are symbolically connected to that word, memories that that word elicits. Maybe you say the word house and it makes you think of your old childhood house, blah blah blah. You know, I hope you see what I mean, that it can get to a point where you're speaking and maybe you're conveying a very simple message, like, hello, my name is Alan and I live in this house and I'm doing this. But as I'm conveying this message, I am, my awareness is actually much more focused and flooded by all of the associations surrounding it than with the words themselves. And so that, of course, I think has something to do with the disorganization of speech, because again it's this issue of being able to pilot the boat or not. If you're aware, if your mindscape is much more focused on all of the associations that your message is conveying to yourself, then you pay less attention to where the message is going. It wanders off on its own. It acquires a life of its own, as in automatic drawing, and it just goes wherever it wants to go, regardless of where you as ego would take it if you had the chance. And so the other thing about this then is that this, what seems to, okay, yeah, this is the important thing. Here I have to refer more to the issue, like the case studies that I always talk about, and I know they're old case studies, but it's just the case studies of R.D. Laing from the 60s and 70s. He has a whole set of case studies about people with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and things of that nature. And in those studies, and in my personal kind of researches into the area, it seems to show that here I was talking about delivering a simple message, like, hello, I live in this house, but my awareness is being flooded with a whole series of correspondences. You know, it's brought to a bigger level, it's what we would call synchronicity, right? That you're seeing all these sort of correspondences between things. It's, you know, being enmeshed in a symbolic kind of language, having a shamanic vision, whatever you want to say it. But until now, I've only talked about you as being the one who's receiving that. But I think that what happens with psychosis, according to these kinds of case studies, and I can definitely identify with this, is that the people in those studies, it seemed as if they were desperately trying to communicate something to whoever they were talking to. Something, it seems to me, about the connections that they were seeing. So it's as if, let's go to the previous example. Imagine that I say the word house, and I think of the word mouse, and I imagine a mouse. And imagine that due to an even more complex, even due to a complexification of a symbolic network that could emerge, imagine that the mouse symbol becomes interconnected not just with house, but with something else, and it acquires a kind of a force. Again, as in the case of synchronicity, that imagine that you constantly see the symbol of the mouse in different places, until it seems to have an importance. It's not just a little cute mental image of a mouse, it becomes like something important, something that feels like it wants to be conveyed. I mean, this is clear in the community of like sync artists, people who try to communicate a synchronicity through art. There is clearly a desire to communicate what is being seen, right? It's as if what is being seen wants to be communicated. So many traditions speak of this. Carl Jung speaks of this, but even William Blake, I'm starting to get into Blake a bit more recently, and he has a poem in Songs of Innocence, I think it's like the introduction to Songs of Innocence, which speaks of how, you know, the angels bring like a vision to a shepherd, the poet, and they ask the poet to express it. Jung also speaks of this. It's as if the experience itself wants to be expressed. At least that's the impression it gives. And it's what a lot of traditions seem to say, right? That there is something that wants to be expressed. And so it's not just that it's not just that people who have synchronicities all develop a desire to express it. I think that intense content from the unconscious of that kind somehow wants to be expressed. It somehow demands to be expressed. And so if you find yourself in a healthy enough state of mind that you're able to make a piece of art about it, as in Jungian therapy or sync art or whatever it may be, then that's great. But if you don't find yourself in the mental stability enough to do that, the desire or the intense need to express that doesn't fade away, even though you're not like mentally stable enough to express it in any coherent way. So then all that happens is that when I say the word house, not just I think of the mouse, but I hope to convey that to the other person, so that I think that's what makes speech even more disorganized. It's that suddenly the speech tries to be symbolic for the other person, to try and clue the other person in. I'm using this as a metaphor. I don't think that there is so much an issue of intention, of like, you know, oh, I'm trying to do this. I think it's more of an automatic thing. That's the impression I get, at least. That suddenly For example, you could maybe say house and then include the word mouse into that sentence, or maybe point to a picture of a mouse, and it's as if, as I was saying before, it's almost as if the correspondences, the sink, is so heavy that your attention is on the sink. Not just on receiving it, but on expressing it. Not consciously, not like, oh, I'm consciously choosing to express it. No, I think that that's why we would consider it an illness or a state of a health problem, is because it becomes probably impossible, again speculatively, it becomes impossible to not express the correspondences. So that, and again, this is just the impression I've gotten from my sort of, my own kind of research into this, my sort of encounters with people in this sort of navigating this kind of state, that what is being said is trying to convey, is conveying something symbolic. Maybe trying is not the word here. I keep insisting on that, but maybe this is not an issue of trying. Maybe it's just an issue of like, it does. It does. Again, R.D. Laing's case studies also point in that direction, that the speech is not disorganized in a chaotic way. It's symbolic. The symbolism of what is being perceived by that person is trying to be expressed. And that's why it's disorganized. Because the linear words that are being said are the least important aspect of what's being said. What's important is what's between the lines. So it's the absolute opposite of what culture considers to be healthy speech. It's the kind of speech where what's important about it is what associations does it have, emotional, intellectual, what is emerging from it, but not so much what the actual linear words are. And so that's why I think that, well, first of all, that I don't think we should treat this problem as being an issue of brain chemistry alone. I don't know, per se, I don't necessarily have any problem with the issue of considering things like these an issue of actual physical brain damage or imbalance. I don't like it, but I don't, but I think I have sort of a bias against it, but I don't really have anything to justify this bias. But maybe I do think that there is a trend today, not just with psychosis, with depression, with everything, of considering everything to be a medical, as in a physically medical problem, a physical problem with the brain. And to me, this just seems like a desperate attempt to avoid confronting the unconscious, and a desperate attempt to not perceive patterns. You see, that's the interesting thing. This tendency in culture is precisely the opposite tendency from psychosis. And I don't think that makes the situation any better. I think that's the problem. In a sort of weird reverse osmosis way, it makes it can potentially make it worse, or maybe my optimistic side is to think that what we're seeing today is like the desperate attempts to, oh God, I don't know how to explain this. Basically, this medicalization of things is actually ripe soil for an intuition about pattern and about symbol to enter the collective mind. this is a recurring debate that I have with myself on these videos, because I'm not sure how this would even happen. I'm not sure how the nature of symbol and the fact that it's so non-linear, how would that even, like, how would it enter into culture exactly? I don't know, but maybe, you know, maybe we should sort of think that there are ways in which a better understanding of the psyche could be had in a mainstream sense, you know. I think that maybe that is something possible, and that it seems as if right now this medicalization of the psyche is exactly what happens when someone's like, when their back is against the wall or something, right? It's like any hint of a symbolic correspondence is being shunned. It's kind of like how in the beginning what happened is that culture rejected like religion in order to, you know, to advance other kinds of ideas. And it's as if now we're seeing like what in my opinion is like an intensification of that trend, where instead of rejecting God, what is, you know, in a prescient sort of way, what we're rejecting is symbol. In a prescient sort of way, culture is kind of unconsciously aware that symbol is divine, or that there is some correspondence between them. But this correspondence is not held consciously, because if culture were to even accept that things like depression and so on have not just a physical medical side to them, but that there is an aspect of correspondences between things, well, that just would be, well, it would be scary, because the psychedelic experience, which is what emerges from this, the synchronicity experience, is a dissolving experience. As William Blake says as well, it's a it's something that dissolves. It's the fires of hell, but in a good sense. It dissolves stuff in order for it to be reborn. So yeah, I don't know, I find it interesting. That's precisely where we're at now, it seems. A complete, you know, reliance on explanations that avoid at all costs the reality of symbol and of correspondence. Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about. I think that it's something that I'm excited to think about, because I think that there are ways. It's interesting to me to kind of, you know, I love Terence McKenna, so it's very interesting to me to try and bring his ideas to new places. You know, I love it when other people do it. I love doing it myself. I think that it's a, how do I say this? It's a conversation that I don't think has died down. You know, it's easy to think that Terence McKenna is the thing of the past because 2020 didn't happen or whatever, and therefore any ideas that were expressed then are irrelevant. Or, you know, the same is said of all these people, of Timothy Leary and so on, that because the 60s proved themselves to have been a failure, that therefore all of this stuff is meaningless. I think that, again, this is just a mechanism, it's like a defense mechanism from culture, that precisely these conversations we're right in the middle of them, so to speak. So yeah, that's it. It's interesting. And I think that's a good place to end it. So, yeah, I don't know. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.